Designing resistance training program, 7C. And this goes to more the exercise physiology and training effects. Some diet and supplements to maximize muscle growth. Protein needs of resistance trained individuals exceed the recommended daily allowance. You just have to check and kind of calculate how much I don't give a specific value, but how much you're consuming versus your body weight. So a lot of times people just eat the protein powder and eat tons of meat, and they're eating a piece of chicken every 2 hours and things like that. And a lot of times the amount of protein that you consume can be very, very high, and that's not necessarily healthy for the individual. As with other types of activities, to be a bodybuilder and to just get massively big, people do it. People do it for a variety of different reasons. But it's not particularly healthy. So kind of keep that in mind. Why are you doing the types of activities that you're doing? Why are you consuming more protein? Am I doing this because I want to be bigger in size for whatever reason? Or are you trying to do this for health? So kind of keep that in mind. Whey protein immediately before and after resistance training is recommended. But just be careful with the whey protein because that can weigh heavy on your stomach. So if you consume it immediately before the resistance exercise, it kind of goes counter to the I would say the same thing with resistance exercise that I said with aerobic exercise and aerobic exercise testing is try to make sure that you don't have a lot weighing on your stomach. That way the blood flow is competing between going to your muscles versus going to your gut. So kind of take that into consideration as far as consuming protein or consuming anything before your exercise routine. And you experiment with yourself, what works, what doesn't work. I think that's very important too. Different people will react differently. So if that works for you, great. If that's making you feel queasy and making it difficult, you just feel sluggish, then I would probably wait or just eat the protein sooner, or make more time between when you eat the protein and when you start the resistance exercise. But definitely after the resistance exercise, that has been shown to be beneficial in recovery. Creatine improves performance. The mechanism for creatine is that you have the first aspect of the exercise metabolism. And the first reaction, the quickest reaction, is the creatine phosphate system. So you have a limited amount of creatine phosphate in your body. If you consume more, then that increases the amount of creatine and creatine phosphate that you have, and thus you're able to do more burst type of activity, weightlifting, whatever, resistance exercise, if you have that creatine. So there's not really much of any benefit, probably no benefit with aerobic exercise. If there were any benefit, it would be with the kick at the end of a race. But I don't know if there's any evidence to really support that. But with resistance exercise, creatine definitely helps. Go to the research literature to see what the dosing should be, as well as with supplements. You don't know if you're actually getting the exact amount of substance that's in the supplement. Sometimes you get more, sometimes you get less. So try to find a reputable source, and then really look up how much creatine you should take when you start taking it. HMB as well increases lean mass. So muscle morphology and resistance training. Muscle hypertrophy is the increase in the contractile protein number and size of the myofibrils, but mainly, for the most part, it's increasing in the size of the myofibrils. That happens through increased protein synthesis, increased myogenic cell proliferation. That is less common, and that would be hyperplasia, increasing the number of muscle fibers. And as with increasing your fat mass, I know none of us are really trying to increase our fat mass, but you have a limited number of muscle cells, a limited number of fat cells. Generally, when we increase our size, we're either increasing the size of the muscle cell or increasing the size of the fat cell. At the extremes, though, you can increase the number of muscle fibers to a degree, as well as you can increase the number of fat cells to a degree as well. But generally, they're just changing in size. They're either getting bigger or they're getting smaller. Relative increases in fiber size are similar between men and women, but men will have more muscle to start with, and thus we put on more muscle. But it's an issue of absolute, the total amount of muscle versus the relative, the percent of muscle you increase. So the percentage is usually similar between men, women, children, different populations. But if you're looking at the absolute increase or improvements, they're greater in men because we have testosterone, thus we have more muscle mass, and because of that, you see greater changes. Older adults can also gain muscle mass. So you can gain muscle mass really at any age. You can gain it at any age, so it's never too late to start. Bone morphology, I talked about this previously. To a certain degree, you increase bone mineral density. The improvements are oftentimes not huge, especially with standard resistance training programs. If you did something extreme, you might see more of an increase in bone mineral density. If you see those guys that they use their head and they hit a pile of bricks with their head. Well, those individuals, just like a ram in nature, as they're hitting each other, they tend to have more bone mineral density in their head because of that type of activity. Most of us aren't really doing that, so you don't see it. But with resistance exercise, you're seeing an increase in bone mineral density, especially the greater amounts of bone mineral density that you do. And then it also helps with the decreased bone loss, and I talked about that previously. A lot of trials that they've seen, you got to think about, like if they do a resistance exercise trial in an elderly, older woman, they're not doing hardcore exercise. They're not doing heavy weightlifting. They're just doing basic types of exercise, basic types of resistance exercise. And with that, they see that the loss of bone mineral density is slowed or is less than the control group, which is great. Now, if you're doing higher levels of training, would you see an increase in bone mineral density? Probably. I'd have to look at the literature to see what they find. But definitely in the younger populations, our population, your population, if you do the resistance exercise, it helps to build bone mineral density to a certain degree. And if nothing else, it helps to maintain the bone mineral density that you have. And it's site specific. So wherever you're putting the stress on the bone, that's where the bone mineral density is going to be improved. So if you're looking at the hips, trying to keep your hips from breaking, you want to do exercise that puts stress on the hips. Now, if you're dealing with an older female, you put stress on the hips, you put too much stress on the hips, you break the hip. So you need to be careful that you don't put too much stress that injures the individual, but you put enough stress that it helps bone reformation. So especially if you're doing those types of exercises when you're young, you don't have any risk of the bone breaking. But in an older population, you have to kind of look at those two sides. What are we doing, and are we potentially causing harm to this individual? And it's again why we're more conservative and we don't do hardcore, high intensity, high weight types of weight training with older individuals. But you can do that with younger individuals, especially if the form is good, and the improvements will be site specific. So if you're swimming, doing water aerobics, great. The swimming is great. I'm not a big fan of water aerobics, but swimming is a great activity. But as far as increasing bone mineral density, I'm not quite sure how much it would improve bone mineral density. Not because it's a good exercise, but you're just not fighting gravity, and you don't have that bone bending and bone reformation that you would have with resistance exercise. So resistance exercise is crucial. It's very important, as well as weight-bearing aerobic activity. Biochemical changes, increased actions of anabolic hormones, testosterone, growth hormone, immunoglobulin F, increased catecholamines, which is adrenaline, which is also epinephrine and norepinephrine. You'll see that with aerobic training as well, that you'll increase catecholamines. Minor increases in myosin ATPase, decreased mitochondrial density, but that's a weird one. Again, it goes into absolute versus relative. The reason why the density goes down is because the muscle size is increasing faster and to a greater degree than the mitochondria. So with aerobic exercise, that doesn't happen. So with aerobic exercise, the muscle size basically stays the same, and you increase the number of mitochondria, so the mitochondrial density goes up. With strength training, the mitochondrial density probably improves a little bit, hence the improved aerobic aspects. You could do more sets and more reps without fatigue with the resistance exercise, but because the actual muscle size is getting better, the density is going down. So that's kind of a tricky, it kind of screwed with my mind for a while until I kind of figured out what was going on. Once I figured it out, it kind of made sense. Because if you say it decreases mitochondrial density, then it sounds like you're saying if you do resistance exercise, you decrease your endurance, you decrease your aerobic endurance. And that's really not true. It's the issue of the muscle size is increasing greater than the rate at which the mitochondria is increasing in size and number. So kind of, I don't know, I thought that was interesting, and I thought it was kind of one of those things where you read it and you're just like, wow, this doesn't quite make sense until you dig a little further. Oh, and yeah, I'm going to go back because I know you want me to just keep going on and on about this stuff. But one of the things that I'd add, well, come on, keep going back. With the, especially the testosterone and the hormone levels, that if you do high levels of resistance exercise and you kind of get to the level of overtraining, as with aerobic exercise as well, the testosterone levels will actually go down, or at least go down a little bit. Maybe not a whole lot, but they will be muted a little bit. So you really have to watch those levels of overtraining and not doing too much. So if you do the appropriate amounts of resistance exercise, it'll increase your testosterone. But if you're doing high levels, especially if you're overtraining, those levels can decrease. I'll also add at this point that what they have found with aerobic exercise is that it can decrease female fertility because they become amenorrheic, but it can also decrease male fertility. So they've seen issues with sperm function and motility and all those types of things that can decrease with especially high amounts of aerobic exercise. So just kind of keep that in mind. You guys are probably not in the stage where you want to have children, but eventually you probably will. And kind of knowing some of those things now and kind of figuring some of those things out is not a bad idea. So neural adaptations with resistance exercise. So you have increased activation and recruitment of motor units, and that's really where a lot of the initial improvements in strength occurs. So really you can only activate about 50 to 70% of your muscle fibers for a given lift. So even if you're doing a 1 rep max lift, you can only recruit 50 to 70%. Now, if you're less trained, it's going to be closer to 50. If you're more trained, it's 70s, maybe more than that. If you're in times of ridiculous levels of stress, if your child is stuck under a tree or something crazy like that, you have an emotional response and you're able to lift heavy weights. You're able to lift heavy weights because you're willing and you're able to work through these mechanisms, and because of the stress, because you want to save your child or whatever the stressful situation is, and you're able to create superhuman strength. And if you think about it, yeah, because the muscle power and the muscle strength is there. We just don't use it all. Now, if you do that, the reason why we have the mechanisms that inhibit that, the Golgi tendon organs specifically, the reason why we have those mechanisms in place is so that we don't have muscle tears. So it keeps us from recruiting too much muscle fibers, which could make the contraction smaller and smaller, and then potentially tear the muscle itself or tear the tendons that are connecting the muscle to the bone. So we have these inherent mechanisms in times of high stress, and it's specific stress, not just you're stressed out. I got this horrible test, I didn't study for it. Not that type of stress, but the other types of psychological stress. You're able to overcome those inhibitory mechanisms. But generally speaking, you can't. So if you do a 1 repetition maximal lift in the general population, you have a lot of mechanisms that keep you from over recruiting your muscle fibers. So 1 repetition maximal lifts are generally safe. So and it's almost safer in the sedentary and less trained population because these mechanisms are more in place. A more well-trained individual, the mechanisms have been, you're able to get over that inhibition, and you're able to then recruit more muscle fibers. Great for lifting more weight, which is generally a good thing, but if that gets to the extreme, then you can run into problems. And you'll see more muscle tears in individuals that are at the higher levels of training than the general population. So the 1 rep max is kind of, in a way, more dangerous in the highly trained individual than the untrained individual, and that's kind of counter to what a lot of people think. With that said, the highly trained individual probably can lift the weight with proper form or better form, and the untrained individual, you have to monitor and watch their form so that they're lifting the weight properly. But assuming that they're able to lift the weight properly, that's what's going on. They're not going to hurt themselves from a muscle physiology perspective. And neural factors play a role in age-related loss in strength. You lose that coordination to an extent. You lose it because you're not doing exercises, you're not using your body, you become more sedentary, as well as some of the just basic aging process. So muscle soreness. At the acute level, so if you're lifting weights and you feel the burn, that's the acute aspects of muscle soreness. That's due to ischemia, so a lack of oxygen to the muscles. You're doing the exercise, you have a lot of metabolism going on, and you're not able to, the lactate that you're producing is increasing and causing that burn. However, delayed onset muscle soreness is not because of a buildup of lactic acid or lactate. Lactic acid and lactate you can't even measure because it becomes lactate almost immediately. Lactate is a salt, lactic acid is an acid. Acid is definitely bad for the body. We control our pH of our blood within a very narrow range, so it becomes lactate quickly. But even lactate, within an hour, lactate levels after a standard resistance exercise session, definitely within 2 hours, but really within an hour, go down to kind of baseline normal levels. So the delayed onset muscle soreness has zero to do with lactate levels. It occurs 24 to 48 hours after exercise, and it's the result of eccentric contraction. So some of the things going on there: connective tissue damage, skeletal muscle damage. So essentially what's happening is that the muscle cells are tearing at the cellular level. So as your muscle is stretching, you're trying to contract it, but you're also trying to elongate the muscle. So as those two forces are working against each other, the muscle tensile strength it can't handle it. So the muscle tears. The muscle tears at the cellular level. So don't confuse that with a muscle tear. It's muscle cells tearing at the cellular level. So you have a low level of damage there. Now, if you think about orthopedic injuries, A lot of times there's a lot of pain associated with orthopedic injuries. I've had a couple of them, and they definitely hurt. But what happens, but I've had orthopedic injuries that didn't really hurt right when I did it. So even when I had my ACL tear, the moment of the tear hurt. But then I went to the emergency room. You can't really see a ligament tear on an X-ray, and that's all they did. Yeah, you need to have an MRI to see that. And it was in Pittsburgh, and in that area of Pittsburgh, there's a lot of hills. So I spent my 3 hours in the emergency room. They said, yeah, it doesn't look like anything, go home. And then I walked up a pretty steep hill to get back to my car, went home. So I was able to do all that activity, even though I had a very significant ligament and orthopedic damage. You see this with football. They have the ACL tear, and they walk off the field, and everybody says, "Oh, he looks fine." No, he's got a potentially career-ending injury with that ACL tear. And what happens the next day? It swells up. You have an inflammatory response. You're a kid. You tweak your ankle. You keep playing. Your ankle is fine. Then the next day, your ankle hurts more. It's swollen and it's blown up a little bit. When you think of those instances, this is consistent with that. It's an inflammatory response. So immediately when it happens, you don't have that inflammation, so you don't necessarily have that pain. As that inflammation and the healing process is underway, that's where the inflammation occurs. It takes time. It takes 24 to 48 hours, and that's why 24 to 48 hours you feel, the delayed onset muscle soreness. But it's the same thing with a lot of orthopedic injuries, that you don't really necessarily feel the pain immediately. You feel the pain a day or two later, and it's much worse then, and it takes a while for it to go away. It's the same basic theory, and I think if you think about it from the orthopedic injury perspective, it makes more sense that hey, this is inflammation, and that's why it takes time to go away, and that's why it hurts the day later or 48 hours later rather than immediately when it occurs. Nothing to do with lactate levels though. So prevention and treatment of muscle soreness, nutritional supplements, antioxidants, various other supplements. I mean, they're probably not going to do much, but the protein consumption, things like that, they do help to varying degrees, and it depends on the level of muscle soreness you have. You have pharmacological, aspirin, ibuprofen, basically anti-inflammatories that will help decrease the inflammation. After the next day, things like massage. Really the best thing for delayed onset muscle soreness is moderate exercise. So the moderate exercise will increase the blood flow to the muscles. That will help the recovery of the muscles. So not necessarily doing high intensity stuff again, but just moving those muscles. It hurts when it starts, but then it helps it and it feels better as you're moving. You have the neuromuscular, the TENS unit. That also is a kind of massage in this instance. You have ultrasound. The TENS unit is the electric stim. You put it on your muscle, it creates the contraction, and that helps as well. There's whole body vibration systems, pre-exercise, eccentric contractions. I'm not quite sure how that helps. There's also cold water immersion. And just ice in general, that will decrease the inflammation right as it happens. It'll slow the inflammation process down. To a certain extent, you just got to let your body heal. You can do these things; they'll help a little bit, but the body just has to go through that healing process. It goes through that healing process. You're stronger. What doesn't kill us makes us stronger. And then you can do the activity better and easier in the future. But with that muscle soreness, you got to deal with it to a certain extent. And I'll add that, when you did athletics, you probably experience a significant amount of muscle soreness. But when you're working with the general population, the muscle soreness should be moderate. Sure, you should have a little bit of it, and you can't do the resistance exercise and become stronger without having some level of muscle soreness, but it shouldn't be extreme. So if it's extreme and the person is dying, they can't do their tasks of daily living without pain, the chances are they're going to quit. If you feel a little bit of soreness with a stretch, that's probably reasonable. And you adjust your workout up or down to a certain extent based on that soreness. If you did a workout, especially in the beginning, and they have no muscle soreness, that's fine. But the next time you're going to do a little bit more. If you do a workout and they have high levels of muscle soreness, then you probably adjust things down so that it's a little easier, and you kind of build back up from there. So you got to use your judgment. It goes along with progression, that you kind of think about the muscle soreness and realize the muscle soreness will get better in time, but in the beginning it will be greater, and just to try to make sure that it's not so significant that it causes pain and feeling miserable. And if you're like me, you've had muscle soreness and you got to the point where you just feel you can't move, you're sluggish, you're sick to your stomach, uh, you know, it is whatever. But if you're working with an individual, that's not the place you want them. You want them to be at. So try to make it. If that happens, it happens. But make some adjustments so that it's less likely to happen again. Okay, that's it.